Well, hello, everyone. It's 12 o'clock. We might have, I see just in the last minute, two or three more people have joined us. It's possible a couple more might join us late, but I think we'll get started because we have a fair bit of material to handle. So I hope everyone can hear me. My name is David Leflar. My formal day job is Director of Legal and Legislative Services for the City of St. Albert. In election years, I also wear the hat of returning officer, and it's kind of in that capacity that I'm on this call this morning. That doesn't mean you're going to be listening to me very much. After another, half a minute or so, you may rarely, if ever, hear my voice again on this call. But I'm here just basically to say thank you very much. I really appreciate those of you who are taking the time to attend this session, and there will be another one later on, although if you've attended this one, whether you'll need another one is, I guess, is up to you. My apologies for having to postpone the originally scheduled session. That was, I guess, a couple of weeks ago now. We had some unexpected personal issues from one of us, so everything's fine now. So I'd like to quickly introduce the team that's here. My Deputy Returning Officer, Cheryl Wong, is with us. Cheryl, just wave your hand. Yeah. Our moderator is Tamara and Dallymore. She's one of our legislative officers. And the person whose voice you'll be hearing mostly is Jacqueline Pelichaitik. There she is. Jacqueline, her normal day job is sort of a special projects and FOIP coordinator within the Legislative Services Department, but she's also one of our deputy returning officers and is a critical member of the election team, like pulling everything together. And that's why Jacqueline is kind of taking the lead today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline. I guess there's only one thing I want to mention. What you're going to hear today is intended to be just good basic information for you as potential candidates. Please do not take it as formal legal advice. We're not here to give you, advice that like a lawyer would give you about your personal circumstances. You're always free to seek that on your own. This is general information applicable to anyone, and please take it in that spirit. And you're also, of course, you can follow up with questions, but Jacqueline will get into the details of how you can do that. So Jacqueline, I'm going to turn the floor over to you now. Everyone be prepared for an interesting hour.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. And welcome everyone. Thanks for making time and for being patient with us as we rescheduled this session. So I'd like to take a moment to cover a few housekeeping items. Just to let everyone know, I do not intend to talk for the full hour. I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions from those who are attending this information session. That's usually where quite a bit of value comes from with these sessions. I'd like to let everybody know this session is being live streamed and recorded. It will be available on our elections webpage for those who wish to go back and rewatch the session at a later date, or for those who are unable to join us at this time. Now, you'll have all noticed that you're all muted and your videos turned off. This is just to keep the session a bit more orderly and also to save on some bandwidth. Throughout the session, if you have questions, just type them into the chat bar and we'll be answering those during the Q&A portion of the session. So for those who aren't familiar with Zoom, on the bottom of your screen, there should be a bar there and there should be an option that says chat. So when you type in your question, just make sure that you are sending that to the moderator. So that's Tamara. I have quite a few screens going, so if you send it to me, I might not get to it. And with that, let's get going. So in this session, we will be covering the items you see on the screen here. So as David mentioned, please note that this is not the only candidate information session we will be hosting. The information included in this session is information that's more pertinent to candidates kind of at this stage in the game right now. Subsequent sessions will focus on topics which are briefly touched upon. And when we get to those, I'll kind of highlight them just so you know that there is more information coming. So as you can see on screen here, first I'll take everybody through kind of the pertinent legislation to know. We'll briefly cover the open offices and the city council. We'll talk about nomination process, which is essentially the most important process right now. Campaign finances we'll cover. We'll do a brief stint going over campaigning, and then finally we'll move into the Q&A. So hopefully I'll only talk for about 30-35 minutes, and then there will be plenty of time for everyone to ask questions. So moving into legislation. So there's a couple pieces of legislation that pertain to municipal elections. The first here that you see on the slide is the Local Authorities Election Act. I may refer to this as the LAEA during this presentation out of force of habit, but I will try not to abbreviate it. And if I do, I apologize in advance. So this act governs all aspects of municipal elections, both for us, the administrators who are carrying out the election, but also for candidates. The Local Authorities Election Act is the primary and most important piece of legislation that candidates must become familiar with. This information session will only provide you with a brief introduction to the requirements of that act, and it's really up to you to become much more familiar with it. So the second piece of legislation on the screen here is the Municipal Government Act, also occasionally referred to as the MGA. This act is essentially the rule book for how municipalities can operate and is one of our key pieces of legislation. The Municipal Government Act also includes some provisions related to municipal elections and eligibility. Primarily, it speaks to the disqualification of council members, kind of meeting the eligibility criteria under the Local Authorities Election Act. Third, I've also included on this slide the provincial health measures. As we're going into an election during a pandemic, it is important to keep in mind that provincial health measures must be followed. So moving on to municipal legislation, the city's municipal election bylaw governs logistics on how the city conducts its election, and the requirements in this bylaw are all in addition to the requirements of provincial legislation. Also on this slide, we have the land use bylaw and the traffic bylaw. The reason that these are here is that they contain parameters around election signage, and we'll touch on that a little bit later once we get to election signage in the presentation. All right, so now let's go over the offices that are open for election. For the city, we have 1 position for mayor and 6 positions for councillor. It is important to note that all members of council, that is the mayor and councillors, are elected at large, and that the city of St. Albert is not divided into wards. Now, as you can also see on the slide, we have included positions open for school board trustee. This is primarily because the city has partnered in the past with school boards to conduct their elections. That said, any questions about running for school board trustee or serving as a school board trustee should be directed to those school boards. All right, now duties and responsibilities of council members. So the duties of all members of council are established under the Municipal Government Act. This is section 153. I have done my best to abbreviate it, but I will kind of just go over essentially what this section talks about. So pretty much this part of the Municipal Government Act says that council members must consider the welfare and interests of the municipality as a whole. They must bring to council's attention anything that would promote the welfare interests of the municipality. Council members must also promote an integrated and strategic approach to intermunicipal land use planning, as well as service delivery with neighboring municipalities. Council members must also participate generally in developing and evaluating the policies and programs of the municipality. Council members additionally must participate in all council meetings and council committee meetings, as well as meetings of other bodies to which they're appointed. They must obtain information about the operation or administration of the municipality from the Chief Administrative Officer, or occasionally referred to as the CAO, or any other person designated by the CAO. They must also keep in confidence matters discussed in private at council or council committee meetings until those are discussed in a meeting held in public. They must also adhere to the code of conduct established by council. And finally, they must also perform any other duty or function imposed by council by any other enactment or by council itself. So that was a quick run through of that section. I do apologize. Legislation is pretty dry. So I'm just going to advance this slide here once this decides to work. There we go. So moving on to nominations and the nomination process. Now we're getting to the really interesting stuff. So first, let's go over the requirements for candidate eligibility. You'll notice these are pretty in line with voter eligibility requirements. There is one key difference that I'll just touch on briefly. So to be eligible to be a candidate, a person must primarily be eligible to vote in the election. So they must be 18 years of age or older. They must be a Canadian citizen, and they must also reside within the city of St. Albert at least 6 months preceding nomination day. So this day is March 20th. So a person must be a resident of the city of St. Albert since at least March 20th. This is different than if you're eligible as a voter. If you're eligible as a voter, you just need to be a resident of the city of St. Albert on election day. So this is one difference. Additionally, a candidate must also not be otherwise ineligible under the Local Authorities Election Act. Ineligibility is covered under Section 22 of this Act, and I would invite you to read that section and become familiar with it. It is fairly long, but the Act is just kind of covering all the bases. So let's talk about the actual process for filling out and submitting your nomination papers. Nomination forms are available from the city's election webpage. Now, if you haven't visited this webpage yet, I would invite you to do so. We will be populating it with information resources as we progress through the election year. This is where the nomination papers are right now. So on this webpage, under the nominations tab is where you'll find those nomination forms. There's a separate one for mayor and there's also one for councillor. So the nomination form is essentially in 3 parts. The first part of the form must be physically signed by a minimum of 5 eligible electors of the city of St. Albert. So meaning people who are 18 years of age or older, who are residents on the day they sign the nomination form, and who are also Canadian citizens. Now, the second part of the form is the candidate's acceptance. When a person submits their nomination papers, they are essentially swearing or affirming that they are eligible to be nominated as candidates, and that also they will accept the position that they are being nominated for if they are elected. Finally, the third part of the form is the candidate information section. This section must also be completed and submitted along with the first 2 parts of the nomination. And these are all available really in that one document for download on the webpage. So important dates to keep in mind. Candidates must file their nomination papers by September 20th, 2021 at 12 noon. Keep in mind, this is very important. The returning officer under the Local Authorities Election Act cannot accept nominations that are received after this deadline. Another thing to note, once a person has filed their nomination papers, they may withdraw from the running at any point up until September 21st at 12 noon. This is 24 hours after the close of nominations. After that point, a candidate who is not withdrawn, their name will appear on the ballot, and if they're elected, they must accept that office. Now, some logistics for actually getting your nomination paper into our hands. It is important to know that at this time, City Hall is closed and nominations cannot be filed in person. Until further notice, a person must mail in their nomination papers to City Hall. You can also drop off your nomination papers in the secure drop box located at the front doors of City Hall, or you can also have them couriered over. There's a few things to note when mailing or dropping off your nomination papers. So in previous years, when candidates have dropped off their papers, the returning officer was able to administer the candidate's acceptance oath at the time of receipt. As current nominations are not accepted in person, those nomination forms must be commissioned by a commissioner for oaths prior to submitting them. If we do get nomination forms that haven't been commissioned, it really just delays us accepting that form, because then we have to return that to get them commissioned.
Let me quickly jump in here. I just want to point out what Jacqueline has just said is absolutely correct for now, because of the reason she gave, that due to COVID restrictions, you literally can't get into our offices, can't even get up to our floor. However, if that changes, and we all hope it will, right? We all hope that the City Hall will be open to the public again at some time, not too long from now. If it changes and our offices are open, we can and would revert back to our previous practice in previous elections of, being able to commission your nomination form for you. But we can't do it right now, not as long as City Hall is closed. Okay.
Yeah, no, and thanks for that clarification, David. That's an important clarification to make. So just to kind of tie off this slide, I also want to just go over instances where a returning officer can't accept the nomination. First of all, if the nomination isn't completed in the prescribed form, if the nomination isn't signed by at least the minimum number of eligible electors required to sign that, so that's 5 electors. And also if that nomination is not sworn or affirmed by the person being nominated. So if you meet any of those criteria, you might just want to look at your nomination form again, just because it would delay us accepting your nomination. Another final note, nomination forms cannot be submitted via fax or email. So just one other thing to keep in mind. All right, now I'm just going to try and advance my slide. Perfect. So moving right along into campaign finances. In this section, we'll be covering a pretty broad overview of campaign contributions and then also campaign disclosures. So we'll start off nice and basic. And actually, even before I get into this, I do just want to say this is generally the part of the Local Authorities Election Act that sees the most change from election period to election period. So there might be some people on this call who are more familiar with the rules as they were in 2017. So when I'm able to, I will kind of just make a note and say what has changed. At the end, I'll also go over some resources for where you could find a document that kind of highlights those changes too. So coming back to contributions, let's just start nice and basic. So a campaign contribution is any contribution made to a candidate that is money or a gift in kind. It is important to note that this does not include volunteer services such as campaign workers who do door-to-door knocking. That's just one thing to note. Now I'm going to just cover really quick loans and fundraising functions. This is new this year. So the first, they're kind of reversed on this slide, but I'm going to cover fundraising functions first. So a fundraising function is any social function held for the purpose of raising funds for a candidate's election campaign. Now, the reason I want to highlight this is that there's very specific requirements on how funds raised this way are calculated as contributions, kind of depending on the number of people who attend the event and tickets and kind of how it's set up. Therefore, if this is an option you'd like to pursue, please review this section of the Act carefully, and of course, seek independent legal advice if you have any questions specific to your situation. Now, the second is loans. Another new provision. So a candidate may borrow funds from a financial institution for the purpose of financing their election campaign. It's important to keep in mind that the repayment of the loan is subject to the contribution requirements of the Act, meaning that payments on the loan by the candidate or by an eligible contributor are considered campaign contributions under the Act. Now, another thing let's talk about on this slide is who is an eligible contributor. This is an important one to note because this is a change from the 2017 election period. Now, under the Local Authorities Election Act, a contributor must be an individual person who is a resident of Alberta. This means that contributors cannot be corporations, nonprofits, or any other organization. In 2017, corporations and other organizations were allowed, but now contributors must be actual people who regularly reside in Alberta. All right, accepting contributions. So as we are currently in a campaign period now, contributions may only be accepted once a person has filed their nomination papers. After a candidate files their papers, they may start to incur campaign expenses as well. So filing nomination papers and actually becoming a candidate is a pretty important landmark in an election year to start doing some actions. At the point of filing their nomination papers, a candidate must also open a campaign bank account in which all monetary campaign contributions must be deposited. This is also a change from 2017. In the 2017 election, candidates only had to open a campaign account once their contributions had totaled a certain amount. I can't remember off the top of my head what that amount was, but now for the 2021 election, account just has to be opened. It is important to note that there are limits to contributions that can be accepted. So contribution limits have also changed under the Local Authorities Election Act. Previously, candidates could receive no more than $4,000 per contributor. This has changed, and now candidates may receive no more than $5,000 per contributor from in-kind or monetary contributions. Contributors can make contributions to as many candidates as they like, so long as they don't contribute more than $5,000 per candidate. Now, the candidate themselves, on the other hand, can self-fund up to a maximum of $10,000. And this one has, I believe, remained pretty stable from election to election. Now, just to quickly jump back to campaign loans, because I want to clarify this a little bit more. So if you take out a loan to finance your campaign, any single contributor can make payments up to $5,000 on the repayment of the loan, and you yourself as a candidate can make payments up to $10,000 on the repayment of that loan. And I'd like to be clear that any payments made on the loan count towards the total cap of $5,000 per contributor or $10,000 per self-funded candidate. When calculating the value of a contribution as well, please review how a contribution is defined under section, I believe it's 147.1 of the Act. And this kind of goes back to in-kind contributions. Contributions also include the value of services and real property to a campaign. So again, if any person needs further interpretation on the requirements of this section, please seek independent legal advice for advice specific to your situation. Now, I'd just like to finish up this slide by saying it is up to the discretion of the candidate if they wish to accept campaign contributions, if they wish to solely self-fund their campaign, or if they would like to do a combination of both, or if they would like to do neither. That is completely up to the discretion of the candidate themselves. All right, now let's go over campaign record keeping and campaign disclosures. So just to put a pin in this, we will be covering campaign disclosures more in depth in a subsequent information session, but I will cover it to the extent necessary today for a candidate just at this point in the election period. So first, I'll give you some background on campaign disclosures. We'll kind of just start from the bottom and work our way up. So the campaign disclosure is a document which must be submitted in the required form after the election has finished. So this form will be available from our website as well. So the disclosure is a financial document in which campaign contributions that have been raised, campaign expenses, and any campaign surpluses or deficits are publicly disclosed and are available for public inspection. These are due by March 1st, 2022. Second, when candidates are completing their campaign disclosures, they must include the names and addresses of those who have contributed $50 or more. This is also another change from the 2017 election, in which the act required that contributions over $100 required the disclosure of the contributor's name and address. Now they have put that down to 50. So moving on to receipts, candidates must provide every contributor either monetary, gift in kind contribution with a receipt for their contribution in a form acceptable to the local jurisdiction. So the form of the receipt will be available from our candidates information page. It's really just going to be requiring that your receipt has certain fields in it. It's not going to be a document that you download and have, a specific form you have to use, but it will require fields such as the contributor's name, address, amount contributed, whether it was gift in kind, monetary, etc. So we will be having an update to our webpage in the next week or so. So just keep your eyes on that. Not finally, but second last, expenditures must also be itemized in the campaign disclosure, and the total amount of all campaign expenditures must be reported. So most often candidates will just retain all their receipts, and this is going to be the easiest way to accomplish that. According to the Local Authorities Election Act, candidates must retain their contribution campaign expense records for 3 years. So you're just going to want to find a nice corner in your house to keep all those records until 3 years from now. Okay, moving on to campaigning. So this section will be a relatively brief overview, as the way candidates conduct their campaign is widely up to them. We will be covering, though, some of the few legislated aspects of campaigns. So first off, let's go over the difference between official agents and scrutineers. It is important to know the difference. Essentially, overall, they do have some similar powers, but timing is more, the time that these two are active is kind of the main difference. So the first one is the official agent. So the agent is a person who's appointed by the candidate on their nomination papers. The duties of the agent are those assigned by the candidates to that person for the duration of the election campaign. Candidates may choose to appoint an agent, or alternatively, they may choose not to. That is entirely up to them. If a candidate does decide halfway through their campaign to appoint an agent or to change their agent, don't worry, you don't have to resubmit your nomination form, but you must provide to us the name and contact information of that agent. Just in writing. Something else that's important to note, under the Act, an agent cannot be an agent for any other candidate. So you can't have one person running around who's an agent for all the candidates. That's not allowed under the Act, unfortunately. Now, just to contrast that with the appointment of the scrutineer. So a scrutineer, on the other hand, is a person appointed by the candidate to observe the voting process during the any of the voting days. So whether it's the advance vote, the institutional votes, the main election day, or even the ballot count on election night. So that said, the agent can also act or assume the duties of the scrutineer on election night, but the agent is active, as soon as they're appointed throughout the whole campaign. The scrutineer is only active on those voting days. We will cover the scrutineer a little bit more in detail in a subsequent information session, kind of as we approach election day. But right now we just wanted to kind of go over the main difference there. So campaign signage and advertising. Campaign signage is largely covered in the City of St. Albert's traffic bylaw and land use bylaw, not so much in the Local Authorities Election Act. So these two bylaws detail location signs may be posted, as well as sizing requirements. And it is important to note that election signs can only be posted by candidates or their agents after 12 noon on nomination day. So that's September 20th, 2021. So as of right now, because we haven't passed nomination day, campaign signs cannot be posted. For details on signage requirements, I would invite you to consult the Candidate Handbook that is available on our candidates webpage. Signs will be covered more in detail in a subsequent information session, just as we approach nomination day and election day, and that way it's a little bit more fresh in your mind. Now, the Local Authorities Election Act does require that no candidate include any representation of the form of the ballot. This is kind of the, one of the few sections in the act that talks about, advertising in any way. So this is the representation of the form of the ballot is essentially a depiction of a ballot that indicates a mark for any candidate. So that cannot appear on any campaign advertisement. So next is campaigning during COVID. I won't go into too much detail on this topic because the resources available to do originate from the provincial government, and as a City of St. Albert, we can't really speak to them too much. Now, if you have visited our candidates webpage, you will have seen links to the documents listed on the PowerPoint here. There is just a separate tab on that webpage that says campaign guidance during COVID. And if you click on that, it'll just pop up and all of these resources will pop down. It is important to note that candidates are responsible for following provincial health measures. As we become aware of COVID resources for candidates, we will be posting them. So really, I'd invite you just to keep checking that webpage back for updates as we go. So we're just kind of finishing up our presentation here, and we'll get into the Q&A pretty quick. But I'd just like to take us all through some more resources that we have available on our website for candidates. The first resource is the Candidates Handbook. So this is a high-level summary of what you need to know to run for office. Candidates should review this document as a starting point just to become familiar with the requirements. Next is the Local Authorities Election Act. Candidates must be familiar with the requirements under the Act. And I'll reiterate once again, candidates are encouraged to seek independent legal advice on the content of the Act. We also have links for the Local Authorities Election Act fact sheets, and I had mentioned these at the start of my presentation. So these are short documents that cover the different requirements of the election, and they highlight changes from the 2017 election. These fact sheets are drafted by the province, by Municipal Affairs. They're a really good resource to look at, and I would encourage you to go and read them over. We also have a link to the Municipal Affairs election page. It has some more resources that candidates may find beneficial, so that's a good page to read over. And then finally, we do also have the City of St. Albert Municipal Election Bylaw just posted on our page as well. Okay, so I'd like to give a big thank you to everyone who has patiently sat through the last half an hour of me talking. Now it's time for the Q&A period, so I'd just like to once again go over the process for submitting questions. So using the chat function just available via the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, just type in your question into the chat and make sure that you are sending your question to the moderator. Otherwise, I may not see it and no one else may see it. If you do send it to us and we don't see it, we just send it to us via email and we'll answer it that way. So we'll just wait a few moments, just in case people are typing. So I'm just going to start off with this question here. So the question is, since I can't put election signs up until after nomination day, is there anything preventing me from advertising in other mediums? No, candidates can advertise in other mediums, such as social media or, via their campaign website. So long as you adhere to the requirements of the Act and that none of the advertisements contain any representation of the ballot. Now there is a question here. What is the advantage or disadvantage, to appointing an official agent? Us as election administrators, we're not necessarily qualified to answer that. Every candidate might find, different benefits from appointing an official agent. Some candidates might prefer just to, direct their campaign totally by themselves. So really in the legislation and case law, there's nothing kind of talking about the advantage or disadvantage. So that's solely up to the candidate. All right. Now here's another question here. If an elected councillor moves out of St. Albert after being elected, are they obligated to resign or do they maintain their role as councillor even though they no longer reside in the municipality? So this one is kind of outside of the election process. David, I don't know if you wanted to chip in on this or if you wanted me to take this one.
Basically, all of the things that make you eligible to run for office, you have to maintain them once you're elected. So if there is any condition or situation of your life or whatever that makes you ineligible to run for council, it will equally make you ineligible to remain a councillor after you're elected. So you have to maintain your eligibility constantly throughout your term of office, or yes, according to the NGA, you do have to resign. So you've mentioned one specific thing, like no longer being a resident. That's one thing. There's a whole list of different things that you can find in the NGA. And any of these things, if you're not in a state of continuing eligibility to run, then you have to resign after being elected.
Perfect. Thanks so much for answering that, David. I see that there's another question here that's come in. The question is there a reference list for finding a commissioner for oaths to enlist them to verify our application? We don't maintain a list of commissioner for oaths. I do think that if you did a Google search for St. Albert, you probably would get a list that pops up. I believe that a lawyer can also act as the commissioner for oaths as well. So if you do have your own lawyer, that could be an option as well. But the city does not maintain a list of commissioner for oaths for your application. All right, so we have a question here about a campaign agent. So it says, the question is, I have someone in mind to act as my campaign agent, but they aren't eligible as a voter. Is this permitted or should I choose someone else? This is a really good question. There is nothing in the Local Authorities Election Act which says that an agent must be an eligible voter. The requirement for an agent is that they cannot already be an agent for another candidate. Additionally, and I didn't cover this in the presentation, But it is important to note that anybody who is an agent or scrutineer cannot have been convicted of any offense under any of the Canadian election acts within the last 10 years. So that includes the Local Authorities Election Act. It includes the Provincial Elections Act, the Elections Finance Act, and the Canadian Elections Act too. So we have a question here about physical signatures from people for nomination forms. So the question is, do I have to get physical signatures from people on my nomination forms? Are there any allowances because of COVID? So currently electronic signatures are not permitted. You must obtain physical signatures. This hasn't changed under the Local Authorities Election Act due to COVID. And just again, to reiterate, candidates are responsible for following all provincial public health measures and guidance documents. As I've said before, as information for COVID-19 does change, and as we become aware of resources for candidates through this process, we will be posting them to our website. I believe right now, and one of the resources I went that was on our slide was the campaigning during COVID document that the province has put out. So that one could be a good resource or a good starting point for this. And now it seems to be, we've answered all the questions, so we'll just give it another minute or so, and then I'll kind of do our wrap up, just in case anybody is frantically typing out their question. All right. If any other questions come in while I'm wrapping things up, then we'll get to them. So just going to pull up my notes here just so I don't forget to say anything important as we close out. I just do want to do another final thank you to everyone for attending and also for submitting your questions. If you have any outstanding questions from the session, please do email them to us. We have our election@stalbert.ca email. You can also phone me. My number is here on the screen, and then we could follow up with you and answer any questions that you have. So just to keep tying this session up, the dates for subsequent information sessions have not been set yet. However, once they have been set, we will advertise them in the same way that this session was advertised, and they will very likely be conducted virtually via Zoom. However, just as things change and, potentially as things open up, that could change as well. The recording for this session will be available on the election candidates webpage as a resource if you do want to rewatch any part of it or direct anyone to watch it. And with that, I'm just going to check to see if there's any final questions. Oh, we had a comment, a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. On that note, then, thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.